Hi, I'm Abby.
I'm Amy.
And I'm Emma. You're listening to a clip from the Read It Forward podcast. And if you'd like to hear more, you can find us at readitforward.com/podcast or wherever you listen to your podcasts. Enjoy.
Today's guest is Ottessa Moshfegh. Her latest novel is My Year of Rest and Relaxation. Welcome.
Hello.
Thanks so much for being here.
Thanks for having me.
So you are wrapping up your tour right now, and I feel like you've been to several cities. You've been to like Portland and LA and New York and all that. You just had an event here at the Strand, right? How'd that go?
Last night.
Yeah.
It was really interesting. Most of my events, it's just me giving a reading and then taking questions from the audience. But last night, Lena Dunham was so gracious to be this sort of like in conversation moderator / therapist. And we just had a really nice conversation. And it just happened that it was in front of like several hundred people. So it was cool. And tonight I'm giving a reading that'll be the last of just me alone doing my thing.
Yeah. Do you choose different passages to read, or do you stick to the same ones when you do your events?
I've been sticking to the same passages, but I've noticed over the tour that I end up honing the excerpts a little bit each reading, leaving out certain phrases that I don't know if it's that I would have edited them out, but I think that sometimes skipping certain things in a reading can make the reading more powerful. So I feel like at this point, I could probably recite things verbatim or by heart, whatever. But yeah, I read from the beginning.
Oh, okay. I was about to ask. Yeah. So you start from the very beginning, setting the scene of this main character who, if you don't already know, intends to and sets out to spend an entire year just opting out of society by sleeping and taking drugs and just being alone, quiet in a room, sleeping.
Correct.
When you had this conversation last night or throughout the tour, were there any questions that you got that surprised you or that really resonated with you, or favorite questions?
I think at each reading, there's a question that surprises me, and it's usually surprising because it's so absurd. But nothing has been so far off or evidence that the book has been totally misinterpreted or anything. It's just like the other night, a woman asked me if my therapist has forgiven me. And I think she meant it as a joke, but it was like really aggressive. And I was like, well, first of all, I don't have a therapist. So what are you assuming? And then I was like, are you a psychiatrist? Because clearly she was responding to my portrayal of the psychiatrist in my novel, which is a satirical character.
And very funny and very like out there also.
Right. And anyway, she said she wasn't a psychiatrist, but she was a psychologist.
Well,
so
then.
Yeah.
Yeah, I feel like maybe a Q&A at a book reading is maybe not the best time to like, I don't know, roast the author.
Yeah. Come on, guys. No, it was funny. I mean, it was funny to me. I was like, wow, you took that way too seriously. Or maybe you have some insecurities about your profession. Who knows? But I have had people come up after the reading. I sign books, and people, so patient and like wait in line, and I end up having weird conversations with people, and it takes too long, and I'm like, God, thank you for waiting, blah, blah, blah. But a couple of times people have come up to me and been like, I'm a psychiatrist, and I have to admit, like, sometimes I'm kind of a Dr. Tuttle.
I think many people who are fans of yours, or many people who became aware of you, first read Eileen, your novel that was first published 2014, 2015? Right?
2015.
Yeah. Which got really wonderful press, and it became a sensation for a lot of people. But I know that you're very, very proud of your first novella, McGlue, and that's being republished with us soon.
Yes.
For people who like your books but haven't read this yet, what can you tell them about it? What can they expect?
Well, what they can expect is something totally different. The narrator of McGlue is a drunk, brain-damaged, mid-19th century sailor who has just committed a murder, maybe, and is locked in the hold of a ship, which is sailing around the world. And its language is really different from the language in Eileen or in My Year of Rest and Relaxation. Its form is much less traditional, I'd say. And it's a novella, and it feels like a novella in that way that novellas can feel more peculiar than novels.
Yeah. I feel like novellas are often overlooked. Are there any that you especially like or that you think are a really good example of the form?
The last novella I read was Coming Through Slaughter by Michael Ondaatje, and it is incredible. It totally blew my mind. And I think the cool thing about the novella is that, I don't know, I have never studied the form of the novella, but it seems that the author makes up the structure, that it does not have to, by its very definition, adhere to the narrative expectations in a novel. So there's more freedom in a novella. And Coming Through Slaughter has a structure that is like almost indecipherable and yet completely sound.
I feel like I've heard a similar thought about short stories versus novels as well. Like the parameters give you freedom to kind of explore things and do things more differently. When you were writing your short story collection, Homesick for Another World, how was that different from writing this latest novel?
Well, approaching a short story feels like more like an affair. And approaching a novel is like I'm getting married. And it also feels like a lasting relationship that lasts and develops even after the book is over. But a short story is more like a visitation, a short visitation, usually very intense, hopefully interesting. And a novel is really in-depth and has all of the, tribulations and rewards of a long-term relationship. So when I was writing Homesick for Another World, I was writing, I think I presented the stories pretty much in the order that I wrote them. And a lot of them were really difficult stories that took a long time. And some of them were stories that came out almost exactly as they appear. The last story is one of the stories like that. And it had such a weird fadedness about it. I felt like it was undoing all of the stories that had come before it in the book and saying more perfectly than I could say what the concerns of the book actually were, that I had tried to narrate through so many different characters over like the dozen stories that preceded this one. So in that last story, when I finished it, I knew deep in my heart that the book was over and that I was done with short stories.
Entirely forever?
I mean, at least in this cycle of my life.
Yeah, that's amazing. I think it's that saying like an artist knows when to stop painting or whatever. I feel like most people don't get that sort of certainty or that kind of culmination feeling. That's really cool. That's fantastic.
It was also a little bit terrifying.
Yeah. I bet it was bittersweet. Yeah. And with your latest novel, it's set in the year 2000, ending with 9/11. And it is very specific to that time period. There's lots of like references to headlines and to movies and things that are, pop culture and stores and things like that are very specific to this time. And I read just in an interview, I think a while ago, that you feel like you have a very specific, like almost intuitive sense about time periods. But did you feel like you had to go back and kind of re-steep yourself in the year 2000?
Well, there were things that I needed to go check, like movies, like when exactly would a movie have been out? And I needed to make sure that it would have been out long enough for it to be on VHS, like some like little checks like that. But I still remember the year 2000. So I kind of remembered what people were like, what people looked like, how they carried themselves, what they wore, what they ate. I don't know. It wasn't that far of a stretch. There is a realm in the imagination that feels almost like tapping into the collective memory of all humans, where I can, and I think, I'm sure it's just me being delusional, but I do feel like I can put myself back in time and kind of hear what's going on. Not very accurately, probably, but my imagination lets me think that I can do that.
Are you somebody who, when writing a novel, you do a first pass and then you edit, or do you rework and rework and rework and then move on? Do you like spit it all out and then edit, or how do you work?
I work in constant revisions. I have this way of working that just seems like I'm only ever really working on the opening paragraph, and that everything is from that paragraph, and I'm constantly returning to it and seeing what it's telling me to do. So I rework a lot, I rewrite a lot. And after I have a first draft, I mean, everything feels very flexible in a first draft until I print it out. And so, I worked on this book, and I don't know how long it took, a long time before I printed it out and committed to anything. And then what I do, my process of editing is very messy because I take my paper manuscript and start editing it with scissors and tape and Post-its and different colored pens and create a collage of the next draft. And then I have to go and create this new electronic version of that draft. And then I read it and print it out again and do that 5 more times.
Wow.
So there's a lot of little bit, if you ever walk into my apartment while I'm editing a book in that stage, there's a lot of little scraps of paper with that are small enough to just be the word "and the,"
You're I'm going to move that to the 15th page.
Right. Yeah. So, and a lot of little scraps in the recycling, little sentences.
That must be a dream for your editor to just.
Well, my editor doesn't know. I mean, I don't think my editor has any clue the mess I've been making. But
do you let close readers beta read at all, or are you just
I don't like sharing the book until I know that it's as done as I can get it.
Yeah.
There's always going to be something that I overlooked, but I'm too much of a perfectionist to be here's kind of what it is.
You're finishing up your tour now, but are you taking off time from writing, or are you working on something now? Are you looking ahead to the next project, or do you like to take off some time?
Well, I took time off after finishing this book.
Mm-hmm.
And in the time I took off, I ended up writing essays and some nonfiction, as well as a screenplay, which was an adaptation of McGlue.
Oh, cool.
So that was interesting. I've also been doing research for a new novel project. And that's what I hope to start doing when the dust has settled after this tour. I also have to go. My tour in the U.S. is over, but I'll have to make a couple more trips to Europe. So, yeah, I look forward to having time to dig into the next book.
Yeah. Can you tell me about the essays? What are you writing in nonfiction?
I've been writing mostly personal essays, and I wouldn't call these personal essays necessarily memoir, but they are memoir-esque. I think I wrote 3 introductions to books, which was an interesting challenge for me. I felt like I had no idea what I was doing, but it was also really fun to be talking about somebody else's work, of course. I wrote an introduction to an anthology of interviews with women writers over the years at the Paris Review, a recently published book of collected stories by Shirley Jackson called Dark Tales, which was interesting because when Eileen came out, people were comparing me a lot to Shirley Jackson, and I hadn't read Shirley Jackson. And so I was like, okay, well, there must be some reason. But then I read her stories, and I actually really didn't relate to them as a writer, but I loved them as a reader.
Yeah.
So that was interesting. And then most recently, I wrote an introduction to Bret Easton Ellis's Less Than Zero for an anniversary edition in the UK. And that was one of the hardest things I've ever had to write.
Why?
I think that book is totally genius in its apparent simplicity. And I was like, God, this book is saying everything for itself. What do I possibly have to say about it? So it took a while for me to find my way in. And then, I don't know. And I was just kind of mystified by it and also scared of it. And yeah, I mean, I think it's an incredible book.
That's such an interesting opportunity that I never even really thought about, to be able to write the introductions to books you love. What a cool thing. Yeah. Probably you get asked this a lot, but it is one of my favorite questions for authors is, what books are you just loving right now? What authors do you think are, need to have more readers? Who do you think is underappreciated? Who do you love right now?
The last book that I read that I absolutely loved was called Alice. And I think the subtitle is Memoirs of a Barbary Coast Prostitute. And it's made up of letters by this woman who goes by the name of Alice back in the early 20th century. She is sending these letters into a newspaper that I think was publishing some kind of column about women. Anyway, these two editors in San Francisco had the archives of her letters. I might be getting this wrong, but they edited her letters into a memoir.
Oh, cool.
And it is stunningly moving. And I mean, it's not that this woman, Alice Smith, which is not her real name, is such a great writer. I mean, it's like you're reading something so personal by somebody who's like, I really feel like this needs to be said, who had no idea that it was going to be a book like 100 years later. And there's so much dignity in the story of this really young woman who gets sort of tricked into moving from her poor town in the Midwest out to the West Coast and narrates for you with total humility and clarity how impossible it was to make a living doing anything but prostitution. I don't know, it blew my mind. I cried reading it. I laughed reading it. I felt really close to her. And it was so moving. So that's the nonfiction book that I would recommend. For fiction, I would name Amy Barradale as the person to watch. And not in this way that it's like, I need a spy cam set up on Amy Barradale, but everything that she does fascinates me. Her collection, You Are Having a Good Time, came out a couple of years ago, and every single story in that collection just gave me brain damage. She's so smart, so funny, so otherworldly in her wisdom and her sense of comedy, absurdity, spirituality, relationships, personalities, everything. And she's a real master. So I tell everybody that if they haven't read that book, like, what are you doing? Go read it.
Those are two of the better recommendations I've heard. Those are perfect. So
Great.
Thank you so much.
Sure.
Appreciate you coming in. Congratulations on the book.
Thank you so much for having me. It's great to see you again.